6 of Anastasia again. Just quickly remind you that in chapter 5, Anastasia's packing her bag with packing her stuff up. So is their family getting ready to move, and she's with her best friend Jenny. They're talking about what they're going to do, and they talk about boys and how they went on dates and how they need to keep in touch together when Anastasia moves to the suburbs. Chapter 6. Anastasia's mother was sitting in the kitchen of the new house in a rocking chair with her sandals kicked off and her long hair frizzy from the heat. "Look at me," she said dramatically to Anastasia, who had wandered into the kitchen for a peanut butter sandwich. "And you are looking at someone who is suffering." "Suffering from what?" asked Anastasia as she spread peanut butter on a slice of whole wheat bread. "Of angst, and sore feet, and heat stroke. And the heartbreak of Prosiris?" "No, the heartbreak of not being able to find anything. Have you seen a picture? Can you tell me how to make iced tea, which I desperately want, without a picture?" "No." Anastasia licked the edges of her sandwich to even them off. "Damn." Her mother stood up and began to look through a half-unpacked carton, like a box. Her father came into the kitchen, wiping his face with a handkerchief. "Did you make the iced tea?" he asked. "I don't want to talk about it," said her mother, tensely stressed. "I'm not asking you to talk about it. I'm asking you to pour it." Her mother glowered at him. "She can't find a picture," Anastasia explained. "Here," she said to her mother, handing her a saucepan. "Use this." Her father sat down in the rocker, in the chair, leaned his elbows on his knees, and looked at the floor. "What's wrong, Dad?" Anastasia happened to know that her father was not at all interested in floors. Whenever he stared at the floor, it meant something was wrong. "I was unpacking the records," he said, "and I can't find the Verdi Requiem. I think the movers stole it." "Dad," said Anastasia patiently, "those movers never even heard of the Verdi Requiem. Those movers were the sort of people that would only steal Peter Frampton." Her father wasn't paying any attention to her. He was only paying attention to the floor. "Also," he said, "I hate the car, and the car hates me. It backfires at me. It keeps running after I turn the ignition off, even after I get out. As soon as I am behind it, it backfires at me." "I don't hate the car," said Anastasia cheerfully. "I thought I would, but I don't. I'm glad you got an old, beat-up car instead of a gross Cadillac or something new." "Here," said her mother, and handed them each a glass of iced tea. "If it tastes like aluminum, it's not my fault. I think the movers stole all of my pictures." She sat down in a chair across from Anastasia's father, took a sip of tea, and made a face. Then she put her elbows on her knees and stared at the floor. "You people are both suffering from post-moving depression," announced Anastasia. "For Pete's sake, when did you come up with that idea?" asked her mother. "Cosmopolitan magazine?" Her father set his glass on the table with a thud that almost broke it. "Anastasia Krupnik," he said, "we have subscriptions to at least 7 magazines in this household, all of them with some intellectual and intelligent content. Why do you always insist upon spending your allowance, your money, to buy that garbage? It tells me stuff." "What stuff?" "Well, one had an issue about lopsided breasts, how to disguise them, and also an article about wives who get fed up with things and run away. Those might be useful bits of information to me someday." Her father made a noise like a horse exhaling. He stood up and stomped out of the kitchen. "Post-moving depression," said Anastasia to her mother. "It will only last a few days." Sam padded into the kitchen. "I stood in every closet," he said. "Sam," said his mother, "where are your sneakers? You're going to get splinters if you don't keep your shoes on." She slid her own feet back into her sandals. Sam thought. "One sneaker is in the closet," he said, "and one is in a different closet. I forgot where." He sat on the floor and examined the soles of his feet. "I like splinters," he said happily. "Sam's not depressed," pointed out Anastasia. "Neither am I. I wonder why the neighbors haven't come to visit, though. Neighbors are supposed to drop in and bring a chocolate cake or something when you move to a new place." "I wish someone would drop in and bring a picture," muttered her mother. This tea tastes terrible. Sam looked up suddenly. A witch lives next door, he announced. No kidding, said Anastasia. How do you know? I looked out a window, and she was looking out a window. So how did you know she's a witch? Was she wearing a pointed hat? No, he said, picking some dirt out between his toes. She had an ugly witch face. Hey, said Anastasia, I have an idea. We need a picture until we find ours, right? Why don't I go next door and borrow a picture? That gives me an excuse to meet one neighbor at least. I'm dying to meet the neighbors. You want to meet a witch? Asked Sam, his eyes lighting up. Sure, you want to come, Sam? Find your sneakers and I'll take you with me. I want to comb my hair first. To brush my hair. She was heading out of the kitchen when her mother called her back. Did it really have that article, the one you said, about wives who chuck it all and run away? What happens to them? Do they end up happy, living in Malibu or something? Mom, said Anastasia, just hang in there a couple more days. Post-moving depression goes away. It really does. The house next door looked like a Charles Addams house. That didn't bother Anastasia, like a big scary house. She even watched the shower scene in Psycho without covering her face with her hands, something her mother had never been able to do. She read vampire books and watched late movies about gooey blobs that grew and ate entire city populations, without ever having bad dreams. But Sam was scared. He wasn't old enough to have developed an immunity yet. He held tightly to Anastasia with one hand and tightly to his yellow blanket with another. When they got to the front steps, Sam let go of Anastasia and dropped back to hide behind a bush. Dope, she needled him and left him there. She went up to the porch and pushed hard on the unpolished brass bell. The shrill rings and sounded inside the house, like ringing the doorbell of a house. After a moment, she heard footsteps, slow ones, shuffling. The door finally opened and a woman peered out from the dim, dark hall. Good grief, she really did have an ugly witch face. Sam was right. She would have looked perfect on a broom. Hello, said Anastasia politely. I'm your new neighbor. My name is Anastasia Krupnik. The woman with the witch face stared at her without smiling and didn't say anything. Her grey hair stood out around her face, tangled and messy, like a nest that Anastasia had once seen high in a tree in winter. What's your name? Anastasia asked. The woman stared at her for a long moment. Finally, she said, Mrs. Stein. My mother was wondering if maybe you have a picture we could borrow, just for this afternoon until we find ours. We're still unpacking and it's so hot we need something to make iced tea in. No, said Mrs. Stein abruptly. I don't have one. Liar. Everybody has a picture unless they can't find it. Oh, said Anastasia. She wanted to say sarcastically, well, thanks anyway, you old bat. But she didn't say that. Instead, she said nicely, thank you anyway, I'm sorry I bothered you. Mrs. Stein began to push the door closed. Then she stopped, looked beyond Anastasia, and said, Who's that? Anastasia looked. It was Sam, who had come out from behind his bush and was looking at them fearfully, his yellow blanket wrapped around his arm and his thumb in his mouth. That's my brother Sam. What is that disgusting thing he is holding? It's his blankie. He holds it when he's sleepy or scared. Come here, young man, called Mrs. Stein. Sam climbed the steps of the porch, carefully holding the rail. It took him a long time because he still went upstairs the baby way, with both feet on each step at the same time. Do you like cookies? Mrs. Stein asked him. I like cookies. Sam nodded. How can you eat cookies if you keep your thumb in your mouth? Sam removed his thumb and wiped it dry on his blanket. Can you talk? Yes, said Sam solemnly. My name is Gertrude Stein. Can you say that? Gertrude Stein, said Sam. He said it in the way that he said Frankenstein when he was playing monsters. Do you prefer chocolate chip cookies or molasses? Both, said Sam. Gertrude Stein began to laugh. Come in then, and I'll give you one of each. She looked sternly at Anastasia. What was it you said you wanted to borrow? A picture. You come in too, and I'll give you one. Then, as she needed to explain something, she said, I like little children. I do not care much for middle-sized ones. Anastasia and Sam followed her into the dark house. This house smells funny, whispered Sam. It surprised Anastasia that he whispered it. Why was it that Sam, who was only 2.5, already understood something about being nice and manners? Some people Sam's age, or even older, would have said that very loudly, which would have been rude. But Sam whispered it. What he said about Gertrude Stein's house, Anastasia squeezed his hand. Yet, Gertrude Stein herself was probably 8 years older than Sam. And yet, Gertrude Stein herself, who was probably 8 years older than Sam, had been rude when she opened the door, or at least she seemed rude. Anastasia remembered that her grandmother, who had been 92 when she died, had sometimes seemed rude. Maybe it was just that people who were very old or very young were the only ones who said exactly what they thought. If they were young, they hadn't learned yet to worry about what other people might think. And if they were old, they didn't care anymore. And the house did smell funny. Sam was right. It wasn't a bad smell. It was just the smell of being close up, a no fresh air for a long time sort of smell. I walk very slowly, said Gertrude Stein. Anastasia had already noticed that. I do too, said Sam. It's because I have small legs. Gertrude Stein looked back at him and smiled. Anastasia was surprised again at Sam. He had said something which made her feel good. What a nice guy Sam was beginning to be. I don't have small legs, said Gertrude Stein. I have big legs, as a matter of fact, but they don't work very well. The doctor says I should go for long walks. Do you? Asked Anastasia. Do you go for long walks? No, sniffed Gertrude Stein. The kitchen was not as dim as the rest of the house, because there was sunlight coming in through the windows, but it was very old-fashioned. Gertrude Stein shuffled over to a thick crockery pot with a lid, opened it, and took out some cookies. She put them on a plate and put the plate on the table. There, she said. Sit down, Sam. You too, girl. Sam climbed onto a chair and sat with his legs sticking out straight in front of him. Anastasia sat down next to him, and Gertrude Stein eased herself slowly into a chair and passed the plate of cookies. Why don't you go for long walks? Asked Sam with cookie in his mouth. Because, said Gertrude Stein with cookie in her mouth, I don't have anyone to walk with, and it is boring to walk all alone. Couldn't you go for walks with your friends? Asked Anastasia. Gertrude Stein glared at her. All my friends are dead, she said. Good grief, there wasn't any happiness or cheery answer to that. Not that Anastasia could think of, except, I'm sorry, which she said softly. But Sam looked up grinning and said, I could be your friend. Gertrude Stein grinned and smiled back at him. Her face didn't look quite as much as a witch when she smiled. I like to go for walks, said Sam, reaching for a second cookie. And also, I like to ride in my stroller. I have a stroller that folds up and looks like an umbrella. You could push me in it. It has a pocket where my blankie rides. Cookies could ride there too. Well, said Gertrude Stein, that sounds like a good idea. When they went home, Anastasia had a chipped picture for her mother, and it was a little bit broken. Sam had 2 cookies in his pocket and a date to go for a walk the next day. Anastasia felt funny. She felt the same way when Sam was born, when her mother brought him home from the hospital and friends came to visit the new baby. They brought gifts, little sweaters and stretch suits and stuffed animals. They stood beside his crib looking down and said how cute he was. Anastasia had loved him even then, even when he was just born and only weighed 8 pounds and hadn't even smiled at her yet. But when all those people had come and talked about how cute he was, she had gone into her own room and closed the door. She said to Frank Goldfish, Don't tell anyone this, Frank, but sometimes I hate Sam. She had a feeling now that she wanted to go to say that to Frank again. She didn't know just why. On the way home, Sam happily said, Gertrude really likes me. Anastasia smiled sweetly at him and said, Wait till she finds out you still wear diapers, big guy. Big shot. At home, there was loud music playing in the living room. The Verdi Requiem, the thing that her father thought was lost. Her father had found it. He was standing in the center of the room with his eyes closed, waving his arms, holding a pencil in one hand. Anastasia giggled. She thought her father was the only person in the world who conducted orchestras that he couldn't even see. She and Sam tiptoed quietly past. She found her mother in the room that the real estate lady had called the solarium. Its name had been changed now to the studio. Her mother was there humming with a pitcher, and she had found their pitcher of iced tea and a paint-spattered table. She was leaning canvases against the wall. An easel was set up, something that you use to paint with. "Hi," she said. "How was your visit? Look, don't you love this room?" "Yeah," said Anastasia. "I see you guys have recovered from your depression, but now I've got it." "What's wrong? Was she really a witch? I see she gave you a picture." Anastasia curled up in a battered armchair. "No, she looks like a witch. Sam was right about that. But she's just an old woman with very messy hair." "So why do you look so miserable?" Anastasia drew patterns with her fingers on the armchair. Finally, she said, "She didn't like me. She only likes Sam." Her mother kissed the top of her head. "Are you sure, sweetie? Tell me about her." Anastasia told her all that she could. "She sounds lonely," said her mother, sipping some iced tea thoughtfully. "Yeah, she said all of her friends were dead." "Well, forgive me if I sound like Anne Landis for a moment, but I think I can explain something. People who are lonely have usually been disappointed by people, so they become defensive. Do you know what defensive means?" "Yeah, having weapons, nuclear bombs. Dad's always bellowing about the defense budget." Her mother chuckled and laughed. "Well, it's sort of the same thing. Sounds as if she has a whole arsenal over there. Her big weapon is not liking anyone. That way, no one can disappoint her, right?" "Right." Anastasia frowned. "But she likes Sam. She really likes Sam," she said darkly. "Sweetie, with all due respect to Sam, he doesn't really qualify as a mature person yet. So she can take the risk of liking him." "But why not me? I wouldn't disappoint her. I wouldn't let her down." "Well," said her mother decisively, "maybe you'll have to prove that to her." Anastasia thought for a long time. "You know what I think I'll do? If Dad will drive me to the dime store." "What?" "Well, someone who never ever disappoints me and who keeps me from being lonely is Frank. I think I'll buy Gertrude Stein a goldfish." Her father still had his eyes closed, so he didn't see her come into the living room. But now he had come to the part of Verdi's Requiem where he always sang along with the record. Anastasia cringed. She lived in mortal fear that someday one of her friends would be there when her father was belting and shouting and singing out the tenor solo from Verdi Requiem, with his eyes closed and sweat on his bald head. Of course, now that they lived in the suburbs, where she didn't have any friends that couldn't happen, her depression came back. Toward the end, at the very high part, her father stood on his tiptoes while he sang. Anastasia giggled and laughed. He opened his eyes when it ended and bowed to Anastasia, who applauded politely. Then he went and switched the stereo to off. He wiped his damp face with his handkerchief. "I'm always too exhausted to conduct the next section after I sing that section," he said. "How did I sound?" "Pretty good. You're getting better, I think." "Inter ovus lacum praestae et haedis me secresto," he said. She recognized them as some of the words he had sung. "Know what that means?" "Nope." "You will after you study Latin. It means, 'Give me a place among the sheep and separate me from the goats.'" Anastasia laughed. "Okay, you're among the sheep? So are you. In fact, I don't know anybody who is among the goats." "I do. Gertrude Stein." Her father put his handkerchief away and looked at her in astonishment. "Don't tell me you've become familiar with Gertrude Stein." "Yeah, just today. Do you know her already?" "Know her? I teach her in a graduate seminar. Gertrude Stein, Amy Lowell, Ezra Pound, and Henry James." Anastasia wrinkled her forehead, looking confused. She's awfully old to be going to school still. No, no, she's not a student, she's a writer. I teach my students about her writing. That's funny. She didn't tell Sam and me she was a writer. What are you talking about? How could she tell you and Sam anything? She's dead. Good grief, Anastasia's stomach felt funny. She's a ghost. I'm living in a ghost story. Gertrude Stein is dead. No wonder she looks awful. Anastasia, said her father suddenly, I have a feeling that you and I are talking about two different Gertrude Steins. The one I'm talking about lives next door to us. She looks like a witch. Oh, well, the one I'm talking about is dead, and she looked like a car mechanic. Anastasia started to laugh. If Gertrude Stein next door were a car mechanic, maybe she could fix our car so it wouldn't backfire. Her father chuckled and laughed. Okay, maybe so. Now scoot. I want to conduct this last section of the Requiem. After you do that, could you drive me to the dime store? I want to buy Gertrude Stein a goldfish. One of the things that Anastasia loved most about her father was that when you said something like you wanted to buy a goldfish for the next door neighbor who looked like a witch, he didn't say why. He said, okay, switched on the stereo, closed his eyes, and began to wave his arms in the air. Anastasia looked again at the title she had written on the day the movers came. The Mystery of Saying Goodbye. It still seemed, as it had that day, a wonderful title. She chewed on her pencil eraser for a while. Then she began the first paragraph of her book. Once there was a young girl, Anastasia wrote, who had, in her short life of 12 years, to say goodbye many times. Her grandmother had died, and her goldfish had been flushed down the toilet and was irretrievable, even though the plumbers had been called. They weren't able to get it back. She had said goodbye to her grandmother two ways. One, by going to the funeral, which was okay even though it was sad. And two, by keeping her grandmother's wedding ring, which was given to her, and looking at it now and then, which made her remember her grandmother in a sort of nice way. And then she said goodbye to her goldfish by holding memorial services over the toilet bowl and playing taps on a harmonica. Her father had sung, Many brave hearts are asleep in the deep. But one day she had to say goodbye to the house she had lived in all of her life. Actually, it was an apartment, but apartments can feel like houses, and this young girl's apartment had always felt like a house to her. That was the hardest goodbye of all, because there was no funeral, no souvenir to keep, no memorial service, no harmonica music, no final flush. Also, it became complicated because at the same time she had to adjust and get used to a new house. This young girl was not a very adjustable person. Anastasia read that again, then she crossed out the last two sentences. She didn't like the word adjustable. It sounded like a training bra. She had to adapt to a new house. This young girl was not a very adaptable person, she wrote. She chewed on her eraser again and watched Frank the second swirl gently around his bowl. Frank hadn't even seemed to notice that he was living in the suburbs now. She wondered if whoever published her book would mind if it had footnotes, things, little comments at the bottom. At the end of the sentence she had just written, she made an asterisk. This is an asterisk here. Still star. Now it said, this young girl was not a very adaptable person. At the bottom of the page, she wrote, there you go, that's what she said. Okay, so that's the end of this long chapter. So they move to a new house. Both of the parents are kind of upset because they can't find their things. They think someone's stolen it. Then they go over to Anastasia and her brother Sam, go over to look at the witch. And she's actually quite nice. She invites them in. She really likes Sam, doesn't like Anastasia. She's an old lady with no friends that have all died. Eventually, she comes back to the house. Her mom's happy. Her dad's happy. Now she's not happy. And she's feeling very sad and lonely again. And that's the end.